Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I was initially going to just film this as like a regular video to upload, but I really am not the biggest fan of editing stuff and doing all that jazz. So I figured it would be easier to do a live, and I can also share my screen on Zoom. So it's a lot less work to edit. And this is a very important topic that I figured I needed to cover. I did a short video on my TikTok, but I wanted to go a little bit more in depth on this because it's honestly one of the most common myths and misconceptions that I have ever heard. And that's related to mares versus geldings. A lot of people in the horse world say that they're not mare people, and they're like, I don't like mares, I'm not a mare person, I only like geldings. And it's way more common to see sales ads that are like no mares versus no geldings. And I would say stallions are discriminated against in a way that is kind of similar to mares, but it's nowhere near to the same degree as what I see with mares on a regular basis across the board. So I wanted to talk about that and talk about whether or not there's actually any scientific validity in that type of thinking, because it does result in mares being unfairly discriminated against. And what I mean by this is when we're so quick to write stuff off by blaming it on like hormones or gender, it means that we're less likely to look further into the reason why and why a horse might be doing something. So when people just look at a horse and they go, oh, she's a mare, she's just being marish, like you're doing up the girth and a horse tries to bite you and they're like, oh, it's just because she's a mare, she's a chestnut mare. Or horses that are really tail swishy and kicky and difficult to ride, they'll be like, oh, they're just marish, especially if they're chestnut, especially if they're a chestnut thoroughbred mare. They're like, oh, she's just a chestnut thoroughbred mare, that's just the way she is, like she's just quirky. And they make all of these excuses for why the behavior is there when the only real excuse is just her gender and the color of her coat, or just the gender in a lot of cases. And it results in people not looking into the whys behind the behavior, which means that if these horses do have any physical issues that are causing them discomfort and causing them to act out in a certain way, people are less likely to look into it and really advocate for those horses because they've already decided that they have a bias against that gender and they're going to blame the issues on the gender rather than looking for the underlying cause. So it is inherently discriminatory to mares. And I also think it's an indicator of internalized misogyny because we see a very similar type of attitude towards women as well. And what I mean by this is for women, it's extremely common to see people like women get their feelings kind of written off and not taken seriously because people will be like, oh, you're just being hormonal, you're on your period. And it's even been taken to the point where people will suggest that women shouldn't hold positions of power for political positions of power because they're too hormonal and they're too moody. And I find this rather interesting, especially with people, because like all of the world's wars and most of the biggest conflicts we've had have been started by men, and it has resulted in thousands or millions of people dying over the course of centuries. And yet that isn't attributed to men being unable to handle their temper in like a productive way and unable to mediate. It's never attributed to their gender. It's just viewed as like, oh, this is what needed to happen. But as soon as a woman gets upset, people are very quick to be like, oh, she's being hormonal, she's on her period, she's acting erratically. And it's an attempt to completely minimize and disregard valid emotions. And I'm not trying to like anthropomorphize horses, but it is within the same vein where they're using this type of terminology and these stereotypes and these biases to completely disregard what the animal is trying to tell them and the valid emotions and behaviors that the animal is displaying. And with horses, like there is always a motivation behind why they're behaving the way they are. And I'm not going to say that every single mare that has ever misbehaved is in pain. However, there's a lot of them that are, and there's a lot of them that are difficult, even if it's not physical pain, due to like emotional pain or mental pain and just not being heard. And I think that mares are pretty good at advocating for themselves and saying how they're feeling, and maybe they're less tolerant of things than geldings. Maybe I'm just saying that as like a maybe. And then people are quicker to write off their responses to things because of that. And Like we see similar stereotypes and biases by breed too, with like thoroughbreds or Arabians. People will be like, oh, they're just like a crazy Arabian, when it's like, no, you're training this horse way over threshold and throwing way too much shit at it all at once, and you're stressing it out and causing it to behave in the manner that you're stereotyping, but you're instead blaming the horse instead of accepting any accountability for yourself. And I also want to reiterate that like for most of my riding career, I've had geldings. Like I've owned mostly geldings, and I've grown up riding mostly geldings. I did ride some lovely mares when I was learning how to ride, and they were great. And I never noticed any differences with their personalities versus geldings. But like most of the horses that I've owned and trained personally, like for my personal horses, have been geldings. And I initially did have a bias towards geldings, and I was biased against mares because of how people stereotypes them. And then when I started galloping race horses, where I was getting on like tons of different horses, like 40 plus horses a week, it gave me a really good outlook on like actually like when you're getting off, like when you're riding like mare, and then you have like geldings peppered in there, and you're just getting on all sorts of different horses, it pretty quickly gives you like the sample size you need to start to consider whether or not certain mindsets are actually reasonable or have any factual merit at all. And when I was getting on all these horses, I was like, okay, like consistently the most dependable horses who were like the least likely to spook, the least likely to have explosive behavior where they really like escalate when something happens, and the least likely to be like goofballs would be the mares. They all seem to grow up faster than the geldings, and they had like a better work ethic overall because they stayed more focused. But the problem would be that when they did start to get uncomfortable, they're more likely to advocate for themselves. Like the worst mare I have ever ridden in my life was on the racetrack. And I see why people didn't like her, because she was prone to rearing, and she'd like kick out if you squeezed too hard with your legs or like did anything to piss her off. She'd react violently. And I see why people didn't like her, because it was inconvenient and it was also dangerous and it made her difficult to handle. But the problem is they actually escalated all of that behavior in how she was handled, because she was constantly punished for trying to tell people how she was feeling and just forced to deal with things. So then she got more and more big in her reactions because she wasn't being heard, and it made her more dangerous. And she also had like massive like ulceration in her stomach and problems that were making her uncomfortable, and people viewed it as her job to just put up with that pain without any complaint, rather than their job to advocate for her as like their caretakers. And it unfortunately resulted in her having a lot of problems, and then she like ended up flipping over in the gates and she like injured herself. She came to me for training, and I restarted her for the track and used like a lot of positive methods, and apparently she was way better when she went back to the racetrack, and then regressed pretty quickly because of how she was being handled. And it wasn't that she was a bad mare, it was that she wasn't being listened to, and she was getting more and more upset because of it, because instead of just shutting down and like tuning out and checking out like a lot of horses will do, she fought for her right to be like aware and having autonomy in her life, and people viewed that as an inconvenience, so they blamed it on her and largely her gender. So I'm going to share my screen in a second, because I actually have a study that they did on like 1,300 different riders, where they surveyed them. And during the study, no one knew that it was going to be related to gender. So they didn't know what they were actually tracking. They were just given a survey of like 300 questions, and they were asked to like fill them out about their horses. And so like that limits the amount of bias that you can have, because of the fact that like people didn't actually know what was being studied. So here, we'll look at it here. This is on thehorse.com. So study, mare is not more difficult than geldings. So if you think a mare isn't the best fit for dressage or any other equine sport, you might be one of the large population of riders with a horse gender bias. In other words, you might think mares aren't fit for some disciplines, such as dressage and eventing, for example, or that they're less reliable under saddle. But according to the results of a new study involving more than 1,200 horses and riders and their horses, mares don't behave any differently under saddle than geldings. And I also want to reiterate that like 1,200 people surveyed, sure, it's not like a giant sample size when you're referencing the rest of the horse world, but based off of the consistency of these results, it is something that people should take into account. And it also is something we should be researching more heavily after these findings. But I think that a 1,200 person study is more than enough to like pretty definitively say that a lot of the mare stereotypes are coming from a place of bullshit. There's always this qualifier when people describe mares, like a good mare is hard to beat. She's a great mare on a good day. And I've seen this all the time where people will be like, a good mare is better than like any other horse, but they always have to say like a good mare. Whereas like with geldings, you're less likely to be like, oh, you need a good gelding to get somewhere. Like geldings are just expected to be good and like more likely to not have problems. We keep believing mares are different, and we go into the horse-human relationship with these preconceived notions, and then we can then jump to conclusions about her not behaving the way we want her to. But what we found is that mares are no different under saddle from geldings, and the findings were so consistent that there was like very little variation. Like there was nothing under saddle where mares scored with higher amounts of unwanted behaviors than geldings. And in fact, geldings scored higher than mares with unwanted behaviors in a lot of these questions. And just speaking from experience for myself, like when you're going out of your way, like when you've already have this stereotype and this bias and the preconceived notion that mares are more difficult, anytime you see a problem behavior, you're far more likely to attribute that to gender than what you would if you weren't having that bias. So for example, you could be riding a gelding and they can kick out and they can have issues, but you're more likely to ignore that on a gelding and not attribute it to their gender, or you're going to attribute it to something else like, oh, the weather, the saddle he's wearing, oh, he doesn't understand this, he's upset, and so on and so forth. But with a mare, people are more likely to attribute that directly to gender. And if you're always looking for those connections, you're always going to find them. And so people are constantly wandering around mares with this already negative bias. And when you're constantly looking for things to prove your bias correct, you're going to find them. Okay, so we'll get into this too. Okay, riders were responding to about 300 questions about themselves and their horses on a wide variety of topics. They weren't aware that researchers were making connections between their horse's sex and their description of issues under saddle. Researchers narrowed their search to approximately 150 questions about how the respondent horses behaved when being prepared for riding or being ridden. For example, they looked at the scores from 1 to 5 people gave about how likely their horses were to show signs of conflict when asked to canter, to shy away from unfamiliar objects, to push handlers when offered food, to not stand still while being clipped without sedation, to whinny when being separated from other horses, to act aggressively to other horses in the arena, or to not respond to cues to slow down. The study found that most questions had a less than 5% difference in overall scoring between mares and geldings. In few situations in which the difference was more significant, the geldings often had higher scores for unwanted behaviors. In particular, geldings were 20% more likely to chew their ropes than when tied, 12% more likely to chew rugs/saddle pads, 12% more likely to not hold still while getting their faces clipped, 10% more likely to push handlers when offered food. Mares, however, were 10% more likely to move away when being caught. So that's a very field-specific behavior. And in all honesty, if these horses are constantly having their behavioral issues blamed on their gender instead of properly addressed, are we really confused as to why they might have more motivation to not want to be caught by the people that are creating these biases? We did find a few sex-related differences in behavior, but these were all related to non-ridden situations. And contrary to popular ideas, it wasn't the mares who were more complicated in these cases, except for getting caught in the paddock. It was the geldings who were showing the largely unwanted behaviors. Suppressing stereotypes and improving welfare. Debunking stereotypes about mares doesn't just clarify misunderstandings about their sex. It can lead to better welfare for mares because you're not blaming every problem they have on their gender. You're actually looking for the cause instead of just taking the easy way out and blaming it on their gender. If you go into a riding session with this type of bias, you're not going to be a proactive rider, but a reactive one. And that forces you down the punishment road, reacting to or correcting the horse. Fenner explained. Or you can go into the ride assuming that if the mare doesn't want to do what you wanted, it is because she didn't understand. This way you can be proactive and prepared to teach the mare, and you can take responsibility for the misunderstandings on yourself as a rider, rather than blaming your horse for being a mare. You can tell yourself, she didn't do what I wanted her to do because I didn't explain it well enough. Giving her the benefit of the doubt is ultimately much better for her welfare. The researchers don't know why mares often have a bad reputation or get stereotyped as being bossy or difficult, but the origins might be an anthropomorphism anthropomorphism. This might be coming from the human world, she said. Traditionally, there are stereotypes against women that they're moody, bossy, or difficult, and it's possible that this is transferred onto horses as well. Interestingly, she said this doesn't seem to be such a phenomenon in other species such as dogs. It's an entirely different angle to explore and research further. So now, I would agree that it is rooted in anthropomorphism, because also just speaking for myself as a female trainer, when I post things, if they are not like overly nice, and if I'm not posting emojis and shit in all of my comments, and if I say anything bluntly, people are way more likely to view it as aggressive than what they would if I was a man. They're also way more likely to assume that I don't know what I'm talking about, because they see me and they're like, oh, that's a young woman. She is probably naive and stupid. And I've also had people bring up stuff that they never would bring up to a man to discredit them. So there is an inherent bias even towards women within the horse world, even though the horse world is like a female dominated industry. And I've noticed it more and more online, especially as I've like expanded my social followings and as I've gotten more educated. People are very quick to discredit me, and they will go rule in favor of men that have far less education and are literally speaking things that have been disproven and are not factual at all. But they believe them because it's coming from a man. And with me, like, I've had men talk to me and other women in a very degrading, derogatory manner. And when they're called out on it, they will not accept it as being a problem. And then they call us sensitive and like we're snowflakes and we're overreacting and we're just being moody. But on the flip side, if you do even anything that's like a marginal critique of a man, even if it's well educated and fair, they're way more likely to freak out on you and act like that's bullying and being unfair. This happened recently on my TikTok page, where I responded to a TikTok where a guy was talking with Clinton Anderson and saying that people don't like him because they don't understand pressure and release. And I responded and I was like, no, they don't like him because of how he uses pressure and release, not because they don't like all pressure and release. Taking something out of context doesn't make it true. And then I had men coming on my page saying that I was bullying this person by criticizing their topic that they'd said. I'd said nothing about this guy as a person, for reference. And even if I had, not all criticisms of what people say and how they behave are bullying. But that was an instance where they framed it as bullying, and the guy that called it bullying was the same guy who had come on my channel before, and in an effort to discredit my views on training, he started, it was the stupidest argument I've ever heard in my life, but he started to compare my views on like misuse of spurs and other types of equipment to abortion. And he was like, everyone who thinks this way is pro-abortion. And then he implied that I've had several abortions myself. And this is something that they would never do to another man. It specifically came up because I am a woman. And that same type of bias is then applied to horses. And I think that it's perpetuated by lots of men, but also women. So there's a certain level of internalized misogyny that's being projected from women onto mares. And I think that we all need to start acknowledging that and seeing where it comes from, because it results in us being unfair to them. We're then blaming them on their behaviors on things that we ourselves hate when other people do it to us. Like when you have a viable concern and you're upset about something and you're trying to talk to someone about what you're upset about and share your feelings, and you're just talking about like why you're upset and something that bothered you, and they write it off as like, oh, you're just on your period, you're getting too upset. And that'll happen often, like even when you're not that if you were on your period it would be a relevant thing to say, but it happens so often that it has nothing to do with hormones or being like cycling or something that may make you more likely to be emotional. It is never really correlated to that, because like for me personally, when people have said that to me, 9 times out of 10 it is nowhere near my period at all, ever. And they just bring it up because it's like an easy buzzword that they can use to discredit me as a woman, and it's something that's specific to women. So it's very likely that men like to use this because you can't use it back to them. You can't discredit their emotions by being like, oh, it's your time of the month. But they can do that to us, and it happens so frequently that we've now started to project that onto animals, which is really unfortunate because it limits our ability to actually properly understand them and make an effort to actually do what's right for them. And with like that study, I think is an excellent example, because so many people believe that this type of thinking actually has merit, and that it's justified and true. But like there's literally like currently there's absolutely no evidence that there's any difference in how mares behave versus geldings, because problem behaviors can exist in any horse. And like I don't know, from my experience, like mares, much like women, they seem to mature faster mentally and just make less silly decisions, because like geldings get themselves into situations when they're young. Not saying that mares don't, but like that's the biggest difference I've noticed is that mares seem to be at a place mentally where they're more mature than geldings at a quicker time, and they're also like less nippy by far typically as babies, even when they're teething. Geldings have a tendency to be way more mouthy, so it doesn't surprise me that like in that study what the geldings tested higher on was usually related to like oral fixations and chewing on things. And for me personally, I don't really view that as like misbehavior per se, so that's not stuff that would bother me, but that's like what they tested higher in. And there is also like differences, any positive difference where where one of the genders tested higher under saddle, it was the geldings that were testing higher. So with that in mind, it means that all geldings either have the same amount of behavioral issues and the same frequency as in the study, or more than mares. But the difference is if people are riding around on geldings and their gelding gets like nappy and starts kicking out, or if they spook, or if they rear, or if they bite them when they're doing up the girth, they're less likely to be like, oh, he's doing this because he is a gelding. Even if they somehow change the blame onto the horse and be like, oh, he's just being naughty, it's not going to be rooted in the gender of the horse. It's going to be something else. If they're not going to use the gender to justify the horse's behavior in the same way. But with mares, that happens so freely and flippantly that it means that mares get robbed of like the same opportunity to have their issues looked further into, and the same compassion that is freely given to geldings and other genders. And it also results in people stereotyping them to the point where they're not even willing to go look at at mares for sales horses. And obviously like preferences are fine, but if your preference is rooted in something that is an untrue stereotype, then that's where the problem is, because we've vilified an entire gender of horses, and it's the very gender that the vast majority of the horse world identifies as. Like there's a whole lot of women in the horse world, and despite that, there's a lot of upper level trainers that are men, even though there's more women in the horse world. And I think it shows that there's still like a level of misogyny where women kind of defer to the opinions of men. And despite the fact that there's way more of us that are starting in the horse world from a young age and like growing up with horses, we still defer to male professionals. And this isn't me saying that like no man should train or that all male professionals are bad. That's not it at all. But the fact that we have such a female dominated industry that still has so much internalized misogyny and so much mistreatment towards women is something that's really shameful, I think, because if there's more of us in here, we have the greater power structure. So at the end of the day, to some extent, we're perpetuating the very behaviors that many of us don't like. And I think a lot of people who are women or who are like femme presenting people, or like honestly just people with ovaries and a uterus, our pain gets written off way quicker. Like we're assumed to be less able to handle pain, which honestly, like I don't believe that men have a higher pain tolerance than women. I'm sorry. Like, have you ever tried to pluck a man's eyebrows or wax their legs or anything? Have you ever tried to do some basic task that women literally do all the time without batting an eye, and men freak out about and act like the world is ending? Plus, women have to give birth to kids. So like that alone, like I don't know. I think women have a higher pain tolerance, but our pain is written off by people even by other women. The amount of stories I've heard of women having like cramps and intense pain and going into the doctor about it and just being told like, oh, like it's just your period cramps, like you're just cramping. And they'll be told that by male doctors, despite the fact that this is a woman who has had her period repeatedly for decades and knows what is normal for her, and is telling you that the pain is unmanageable and that it's worse. And that'll get written off. And there's like a number of stories of women who have tried to go to the doctors multiple times, and when they finally get a doctor that actually looks further into things, they'll be found to have like really bad issues internally, like bad endometriosis or something else, that like a tumor or something that causes like immense pain, that was written off because people are just assuming that women are less able to handle pain and that they're just whiny and emotional. And it crosses over even to like our medical sector as humans. So it's not even just the horses that we do this to. It happens to female, like human women, uterus having people in the real life, because there is such a stereotype against how like female presenting people feel about things. And I think it's a real shame that we have so many women in the horse world that are willing to do the very same thing that most of them hate having happen to them. They're willing to do the same thing to horses. And like we can do better. And like I say this as someone who used to have a lot of these same biases. Like I used to be way biased in favor of geldings, and I still mostly have geldings, but that's like mostly a coincidence. So obviously I didn't pick Banksy's gender and stuff, but like it's time that we start to like actually hold ourselves more accountable, because it's very, very easy, like as a person, to just be like, oh, like this horse is just being a mare, or they're just being naughty, and like blame the horse for the reactions that you may be causing in training. And I also see this with people who will say like, oh, it's natural selection when a horse panics when they do something too fast and endangers themselves. They're like, oh, it's just natural selection, they need to learn somehow. And it's like, you are the trainer. You should be, if a good trainers alter their methodology to suit the horse in front of them. And if you're not going to alter how quickly you introduce things just because some other horses were okay with it, then you're not a good trainer, and you're blaming the horse's reaction as an easy way out to avoid holding yourself accountable for what you caused. And blaming the horse is very, very easy to do. It's an easy outlet that cannot argue with you on shit. Like they can't contradict you at all. So it's way easier as a trainer to look at a horse and complain about what they're doing and being like, oh, 1 second. Yeah. So with mares, like we've created this culture that basically justifies the mistreatment of them. And it, like I've seen so many horses who I've found like some owners do look further into health issues, and they actually like try to figure out what's going on with their horses, and that's great. But I've seen like a lot of mares that have had like clear physical issues that are being just ruled as like just being marish, where horses are like always kicking out, their tails like ringing the whole time they're riding, and people are just like, oh, she's just a mare, like this is just how she is. And it's like they're not less deserving of like care to check out what's going on with them. And I do understand that like there's a limit. I'm not saying like anytime your horse shows a conflict behavior to immediately take them to the vet or whatever, but like at some point we need to start holding ourselves more accountable as riders and trainers, because it's way too easy to just blame everything on the horse. And it's funny because a lot of people that do, like most horse people have done this at least at some time, but it's funny because most horse people will also say like it's never the horse's fault, but then like our actual behavior and our actions never usually reflect that. Like we say it's never the horse's fault, but then we'll blame it, oh, they're just a mare, this is a chestnut mare, oh, they're being dramatic or naughty, they're being bad, they're doing this on purpose, they're stubborn, oh, that's just the way he is, he's just quirky. All of it is blaming the horse with like without it being as like overt. And it means that trainers can do really harsh things to horses and not hold themselves as accountable. And it means that trainers can do mistakes that result in the horse reacting poorly and not hold themselves as accountable. And then this is kind of like how people funnel into being really abusive, because a lot of people who are doing these things, they're not actually abusers to their horses. They do love their horses, they do care about them, but they're just misled. But the people that do take things way too far, this exact type of mindset of pawning off accountability onto the horse and blaming like the gender, the color, the breed, that type of mentality funnels into people being extremely harsh and rigid in their methods, and just like it getting off from controlling the horse so completely that when the horse does fight back, that it's like more of a game to them, and they find it like they're the ones that are like laughing when horses are in incredibly dangerous situations, completely panicking and freaking out. And we enable them in how we handle other things in the horse world. There's little tiny things that are small and that we shrug off on a frequent basis that contribute to the bigger picture and result in horses being harmed. because of the types of attitudes that we normalize and perpetuate in the horse world. And it's about time that we start to like change it, I guess, because especially as a female dominated industry, it's like pretty fucking embarrassing that there is such a sexism towards an entire gender of horses. And also like it even comes down to like the amount of credit people give stallions for babies and their progeny versus the mare. Because like the mare is 50% of the genetic potential, but you almost always only hear people talking about the stallions. And it's just like a very clear discrimination against gender. And again, there's no science that this is rooted in. This is rooted entirely in like myth and stereotype. So I think that's what people should take out of this, is even if you've had a preconceived notion about mares, or even if you would believe a lot of the stereotypes, start to reframe your thinking. And next time you see a mare reacting to something, try to look at it the same way you would for a gelding. If a gelding was exhibiting the same behavior, you wouldn't be so quick to blame it on gender. So why don't you start looking further into what is prompting the behavior, rather than just shrugging it off and be like, oh, they're just a mare? Because honestly, like, mares aren't just bitchy, mean creatures. Like, they're very nice, and if they're not being nice, then you might want to look into why they are being that way, because it's probably from people chronically ignoring their like attempts to talk about how uncomfortable they are. And I wouldn't be very happy or kind either if no one was listening to me when I was in pain. The other thing to consider is that, yes, like when mares are cycling, like when your mare is in heat, she could have cramps. She could be uncomfortable. And because of that, like, is that not justified and relevant just because it's like a routine hormonal thing that happens? Like, her pain is still relevant, her discomfort is still relevant, and you should be, instead of getting mad and forcing her to work through it, you should be facilitating and either helping her be more comfortable in her heat cycles, or be more comfortable in riding, or changing what you do for certain days, because it's really not that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things, in order to be like kind. Because like, I don't know, for those of us who have really bad cramps, would you want to have someone that like doesn't speak your language just like rigidly like chasing you into doing heavy physical labor when you are like writhing on the floor in pain? Probably not. So we should start to try to think of things the same way. And honestly, it goes for like any gender of horse too, because like we have aches and pains. Like, we've slept wrong some days and been sore. And why do we assume that animals don't experience the same things? Why do we assume that they might not have, like, that they don't have off days where they're not feeling totally fine physically? We shouldn't be assuming that. And we should be giving them the benefit of the doubt more. But more importantly, like, bringing it like we're above reducing things to like gender stereotypes, and we really need to move past that, because like I said, there is literally no science like showing us that it's true. So there's really no reason to believe it other than stereotypes. And like, as we've already established in previous videos, there are lots of stereotypes and myths that have been perpetuated in the horse world for a long time, but it doesn't make them true. So it's up to us to kind of start to undo this behavior and start to question why we do certain things the way we do in the horse world. Because if we don't do it, it's just going to keep continuing, and it's not fair to the horses. Like, we're better than this. We can do better. And the other thing too is that there's not really any, like, the chestnut mare stereotype comes out of nowhere, and it's just people literally looking for things to fit that. They'll get horses, and like, chestnut's one of the more common colors, so obviously you're going to meet a lot of chestnut horses. And if you're just assuming that like, oh, all chestnut mares are more cranky and more likely to have problems, then anytime they show you something that supports that, you're going to take note of that and remember it. But then all the times that they're not supporting that, you're not going to take it in the same way. So if you're only looking for certain things to prove your bias is right, then there's not any hope in you realizing that that's not actually the case, because you're literally selectively cherry picking instances in your head that support what you already want to believe. And this is what a lot of horse people are doing. And I don't know, like, yeah, I've had chestnut mares that have fit the stereotype, but I've also had a lot that don't. And I've also had like bay geldings that fit the stereotype of a chestnut mare. Like, And even with my horse Milo, like Milo doesn't like other horses that much. Like when he's walking by them, he'll pin his ears at them if they're not like his friends. And every time I've ever posted videos of him doing that, people will be like, oh, like just a chestnut mare. And I'm like, this is a fucking gelding. And that shows how people literally don't know what they're talking about, because they're just looking to cherry pick things that prove them right. Like any videos I've posted of Milo pinning his ears or doing anything where he looks cranky, people assume that he is a mare. And that is like so incredibly sexist and weird that I like, it's something it's always bothered me. And like I do get that he's got a very pretty typey face that might look more feminine to some people, but the amount that he is classified as a mare when I'm posting any instance of him pinning his ears or looking cranky in any setting, it's almost every single time people will be like, mare, 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 this has to be a mare, typical chestnut mare, typical mare. And I'm like, this is a gelding. This is in fact a fucking gelding. So you don't know what you're talking about, and clearly it's not a typical mare if you're labeling a gelding as this. But yeah, like that kind of shows and speaks for how like rooted in misogyny this type of myth is. And I just wanted to talk about that study and share it in a little bit more detail, because this is a problem that is very commonplace in the horse world. Like a lot of riders and trainers believe it. Like even people who are newer to the horse world have probably heard this in some capacity. It is very, very common, and it's time we start to undo it, because now we have evidence that shows us that it definitely is not true. Like that study, their mares didn't even surpass geldings like in any setting, like other than being hard to catch by like 10%, which is like, yeah, I understand why they don't want to be caught if their problems are all being ignored. But like it was like it's so consistent in the findings that even though it's not the largest sample size in the world, like 1,200 horses is still a lot, but even though it's not the largest sample size in the world, the findings are so consistent and there's no skews that are like way higher in mares. So it shows us that like at the bare minimum, we're way inflating the reality of this stereotype, and we're way overselling how difficult mares actually are based on our own issues. And I don't know, like for me personally, I've learned lots going into my 20s, like from early 20s to now at 26, the amount of stuff that I have noticed and like learned about like internalized misogyny and like the patriarchal society has absolutely like, it's on a trend like this. Like I've learned a lot, and I've started noticing more things in how I'm treated versus men. And it pisses me off because it's so stupid, and like women are valid and our struggles are valid, and the fact that we cycle once a month or that uterus having people may in fact have a period, that doesn't delegitimize our struggles and our pain and our upset and our anger. And for centuries now, it's been used as an excuse to say like, oh, like women are just emotional and just like shrugging off anything that they feel and shrugging off their anger and their upset and their pain. And then you have people that do react more angrily, and they might have reactions that seem too large for what happened, but it's like anger that has gone unaddressed for lengthy periods of time. And then you have explosive, really, really upset anger that is at a way higher degree than it would be if it was properly addressed at an earlier stage. And with the mares, this is essentially what happens too. People stack all these triggers, they ignore all of the warnings their horse gives them, and then they have these big reactions that seem like they come out of nowhere, where their mare might like kick them or something, and then they're like, holy shit, like what a mean bitchy mare. But really the horse would have given them like in general like hundreds of warnings first, and they've gone ignored, and then they feel like they have no other choice other than to get way louder. And we wouldn't lead them to that state if we were better at like acknowledging their emotions and their behaviors and allowing them to be like actually legitimate, and we don't. But yeah, I'm gonna end this live soon, but basically I just want to finish it with saying that there is currently no scientific evidence that mares are more difficult than geldings, and the scientific evidence we have actually proves the opposite. So next time you find yourself criticizing mares or assuming that they are like more difficult or more bitchy than geldings, ask yourself about your internalized misogyny and get to the bottom of why it is there, because it will help you in your future, and it'll also help you train horses better, because you won't be stereotyping them from the moment you see what type of genitals they have. So how about we kind of undo that, deal with the horse you're on, and take note of any of the behaviors they offer you regardless of gender, and look at the motivating factor for that, because there usually is one. And like it's just absurd that like anytime there's like an unwanted behavior or crankiness or something, that like it's almost immediate that people assume that the gender has to be a mare. And like there's been so many cases where I've seen people doing that, like including with my own horse, as I mentioned, where the horse is a gelding. So it's like, come on, like they're literally just waiting for instances that prove their preconceived notions right. And there's a lot of instances where they think that and they're proven wrong, and that's not actually the case. So just something to think about. And yeah, since there's no current scientific evidence showing anything other than that mares are actually less likely to have problem behaviors than geldings, we have no reason to continue perpetuating this. It'll help us become better riders and trainers if we stop doing this. And it'll also probably improve the treatment of women overall if we stop perpetuating the same type of misogyny that is normalized when it's directed at like human female people and like femme presenting people. Anyways, this is my Banksy for President sweater, and I really like it. So if you like one, you can get it at my store, shopmilestoneequestrian.com. And yeah, there's some cool stuff in the works. I just think this is really funny, personally. I know it's not everyone's cup of tea. That's like most of my designs. I'm just like, I think this is funny. I'm gonna make it for myself, and if other people buy it, cool. But yeah, so consider your biases, because especially for those of us who started riding young, it's very easy to develop biases and just take them with us for life. So it's up to us to start undoing them and start questioning why they exist. And we can't better ourselves as equestrians until we do that. And like I said, I used to be like very pro gelding, anti-mare, and I didn't want mares. And like a lot of my project horses ads in like the beginnings when I was starting to get project horses were probably like geldings only. And like now, like my only difficulty with mares is that I don't really want to put one mare in a field with like 6 geldings, because then like they fight over it, especially the ones that are like more think they're stallions. But really that's my only issue with mares, is like turnout situations. If I had like a massive field, they would all go out together and it would be no issue. So but like other than that, like no, there's nothing that I have noticed ever. Like, and I've ridden a lot of horses, especially at the racetrack. That's where you're like getting on so many different horses a day. And like all of the most dangerous horses I've gotten on, with the exception of that one mare that I told you about that was having issues that explained her reactions. All of the like most difficult horses I've gotten on that have been like the most dangerous were geldings. And I'm not saying geldings are more dangerous than mares. It's just something that I've noticed. And like as soon as I stopped looking for reasons to blame mares' issues on their gender, I started seeing a lot more things that geldings were doing that created behavioral problems. So that's something to consider when you're riding, because it'll help you. And yeah, next time someone's stereotyping mares, send them this study. It's on thehorse.com. If you just look geldings mares study on Google, it'll come up. I can also edit the link into the description of this so that people can go look at it. But yeah, consider that, like that next time, even if it's your trainer saying it, like catch them and be like, hey, have you seen this study that they've done comparing mares and geldings and the problem behaviors depicted in them, and show it to them. It might change their opinion, it might not, but at least like seeing it might actually put like that kind of question mark in their head that kind of stops them in their tracks at least a little bit, and question the validity of stuff that they once blindly believed. So yeah, check that out. And then also, yeah, if anyone's interested, I have like my TikTok page, my Patreon channel, where I post tutorials and other stuff on. So you can subscribe to that for as little as $1 a month for anyone who's interested. We have a lot of videos and like a big video series that will be coming out onto Patreon soon. So I highly recommend. And thank you, everyone. And I hope you all have a splendid day. And I hope you stop stereotyping mares if you were, because there currently is